So why did America invade Cuba? Well, Kennedy wanted to know the answer. Will invading Cuba be successful? So he asked the CIA that, and the CIA officer, the person in charge of the CIA, said, timely execution of this plan has a fair chance of success, by which he meant about 25%. Kennedy had his science advice. He knew that meant about 50%, so he went ahead. Why did we invade Iraq? Because one of the reasons, there's a number of reasons, obviously, is that President Hussein had nuclear weapons. And I'm sure you probably all remember this, that there's a couple of main arguments. One is that about to do with aluminium tubes for power stations, and one is about importing uranium from Nigeria. The Department of Defense in the US knew about nuclear power plants, and they knew that that wasn't any use. They didn't know much about what was going on here, but they used that as their main argument. The CIA knew about the evidence base as to whether or not this had happened, and they knew that probably hadn't happened. They didn't know much about nuclear power, but that was their evidence base. So between them, by accepting the evidence in the area they didn't know, there was a consensus that he had nuclear weapons. Push yourself back. Is Osama bin Laden living in Abbottabad? Here, President Obama did it in quite a sensible way. He brought a group of people together and asked them to guess their probabilities. The responsible CIA team leader said 95%. The director, deputy of intelligence, 60%. Most of the people in the room, about 80%. There's some people that were asked to be very skeptical about that, 30 to 40. Overall, about 69. But then Obama said that the discussion seemed to offer more confusion. Advisors were offering probabilities disguising uncertainty as opposed to actually providing more useful information. And his conclusion was about 50-50, even though that seemed to go against the evidence base. We've just made the decision to bomb Syria, and I'm not saying whether or not I'm in favor of that or not, but speaking to people that have seen how that decision is made, it seems that it's not made in the formal putting together the evidence, building up the case, looking at the probabilities way that you and I might hope that would be the case. So there's a problem, and there's a number of problems. And one of the big problems is that experts are pretty hopeless. I can say that as an expert. There's a problem here. And there's a very nice study by Philip Tetlock, and it's published in this book, Expert Political Judgment. And what he did was he took 284 people whose job it was to provide advice on political and economic trends. And between them, they made 82,000 forecasts. So how many, and he did it in a simple way. He said, for this thing we're forecasting, what is the probability that it'll be the same? What's the probability there'll be some more of it? What the probability there'll be some less of it? So you say, for the number of Democrat senators in the next election, do we think it's going to be the same, or go up, or go down? Is the oil price going to go up, go down, et cetera, et cetera? And they made 82,000 of those. And they were less good than chance. They were not significantly better than non-experts. It was very difficult to pull out any patterns as to what made them successful or not. Some of them made very public declarations. Some of them were people that were very involved in public declarations about what's going to happen. They turned out to be less good than the others. So there's a serious problem here. And you say, well, of course, the solution is you just don't use experts. Just use the evidence. And that seems a good idea. But here I put together a sort of how you might make a decision. You think of a problem, you think what the solutions might be, you shortlist those you're going to do, you decide how you're going to assess it, you decide on the literature you're going to read, you decide on the search method, the search terms, you decide on what data you're going to extract from it, you decide how you're going to weight the studies, you decide how you're going to collate it, you're going to do a meta-analysis, et cetera, et cetera. You decide how you're going to interpret those results, how you're going to present those, what conclusions you're going to draw from that. You're using expert judgment at all of these stages. You can't get away from the fact that we use expert opinion. So, what I'm saying is that the use of experts is often problematic. Experts are often pretty useless, but they're essential. So we just need to use them as well as possible, and we can adopt processes to improve how they're used. And there's a bit of an evidence base as to what works or not, and I'd like to quickly talk about that. So everyone says it's sensible to ask decision experts to make decisions for you. I think that's almost right. I just want to change a little bit. It's rarely sensible to get them to make decisions, although that commonly happens. And the reason is this. It's extremely unlikely that the experts you bring in will share your values. If you bring some researchers in, they say, well, we need more research. Well, of course they will. People have interests, and they will express those interests rather than your interests. So what you want to do is ask for their judgments on facts, and then combine their judgments on the facts with your values to decide what to do. You don't say, should we do this? You say, if you do this, what would happen? And then you make the decision. Okay. So with Mark Bergman, I became interested in this issue of how you use experts, and then we wrote this piece pulling together some of the evidence. The thing that most surprised me is the remarkable number of people who asked why there's a drawing of me riding a badger to illustrate this. Anyway, so I'm going to run through the various rules we had. So firstly, the evidence is overwhelming that groups are better than individual estimates. This goes back to Galton, 100 years ago or so, who looked at the data at a county fair where people were guessing the weight of an ox that they could take back and eat, I think, if they won. And there's a mass variation. The experts were all completely out, whatever. But when you looked at all the collated data and you plot it cumulatively, the median was within a couple % of the right answer. And this seems to be very often true. Not always true. There are lots of well-known cases I'm sure you can think of where the public get things wrong. But groups are better than single individuals. That's undoubtedly clear. And just an example of this, with Tatsuo Mano, we've got people to estimate the number of people in different countries, and this looks at the error rate, and you can see if you collate those, if you increase your sample size, the error goes down massively. We only did this with 30 people or something, which is why we're asking you to fill in that form. We're really, really keen if you could fill in that form. It only takes a couple of minutes. Do it during questions. Do it during a boring bit of the talk. And we'd love to have that data. We want to expand this data to 600 people. That would be fantastic. The other thing it shows is that people often use the median estimates, the mean estimates, and the median is enormously stronger. And there are various other bits of information we can pull out if you help us and answer that. So I'd be grateful if you did. That's this form here. Next important point is that people are genuine experts in an area. I'm not for a minute denying that. So I kind of like to think I know a fair amount about oyster catchers and about brent geese, so I'm up on here somewhere. I was asked to be on a DEFRA panel to review the evidence on badgers, which I think is okay. I'm an expert in black and white animals, so that seems fine. So I'm sort of here somewhere. And then I was invited as part of a part of a NERC panel to be reviewing the case for restructuring the way the research institutes work. And I said at the time, look, I'm here somewhere. I'm here as an expert because I know about oyster catchers. And I'm restructuring research panels, research centers. How does that work? We experts are very confident and think, I'm an expert in this subject, I'm an expert all the way across here. The evidence is that the evidence falls off really quickly, and they're not experts outside their area of, their really narrow area of expertise. Remarkably, it's very difficult to work out who the experts are, and the sort of measures you would have, age, number of publications, technical qualifications, years of experience, all of that stuff doesn't make any difference. It's very hard to find out who the real experts are. I'll come back to that. If you have diverse groups, they're more likely to come up with the right answer than if you have groups that think in the same way. People who are less self-assured and assertive and use a wide spread of information tend to be better. And it's very interesting. I've come across quite a few cases where there's a group of people dithering, and someone will be very confident and very assertive and say, this is the way forward, and the group will usually go with them. That person is less likely than average to be right. You're going with the person who's most likely to be wrong in the group. So there have been various studies, for example, in earthquakes, where you give people past examples and say, do you think the earthquakes would have occurred there? You look to see who's good and who's poor, and then you weight the results by their previous ability to predict, and that increases the performance. You find out who are the good people and who are not at this sort of task, and that improves things. You can train people, particularly in terms of probability, as to what the probability of events, and they get better if you do that. And if you look at people that make short-term predictions, where the outcomes, so intensive care physicians, I think you're just about to die of this, you go in, and they're quite likely to die, and you cut them open and see whether or not they did have whatever that was said. There's that immediate response. They tend to be much better than people with the long-term predictions, economic, geopolitical, environmental, etc. So the rapid feedback makes a big difference. So why am I telling you this? Who could use this sort of information? There's a whole range of ways in which could happen. I just want to give two examples. The National Ecosystem Assessment, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment are just wonderful. They're serious contributions. I think they're very impressive. Let's have a look at this column here. This is pollinators. This is a pollination service. A circle means there's high evidence for confidence. So we're confident that, and the arrow means if it's going down or going up, and the color means how important it is. But I'm only interested in the arrow and the circles. So we're high level of confidence. The pollination service is going down in mountains, in semi-natural grasslands, in farmed woodlands, in enclosed farmland, staying the same in woodlands, staying the same in urban, it's staying the same in coastal margins. As my colleague Lynn Dix has pointed out, we haven't the faintest idea. We have no evidence on any of these, and yet we state that we have high level of certainty. And I wrote a piece in Nature about the way in which I think we should do assessments. The way we tend to do assessments is we have these long, extensive discussions, which, as we pointed out, you can then find all sorts of problems with. If you want to be a critic, it's very easy to find wrong material in there. A better way of doing it, I think, would be to have a smaller number of facts, such as this, collate the evidence base on each of these, and then use experts in a more systematic way in order to say whether or not there's strong evidence or not. And you could then use experts to then collate that information. Another random example, grant funding. I can think of as on a panel, we spent £60 million in 2 hours. I could write a PhD on the biases in the process that we adopted. It committed all the sins that you could do, and the sorts of expert judgment issues I've described would have enormously improved that process and reduced biases. So, what are the processes by which we could do this differently? I'm going to talk about a couple, or three. One really interesting one is prediction markets. So if you went online a week or so ago when I started writing this talk, You could go on to predict it, and you could buy a share on, well, Rousseff remained president for 92 cents. And if that turns out to be right, by the end of the year, will she still be president at the end of the year? If that is right, you'll be given $1. There's an 8% chance that she won't. People say, if you bought a share in that, and that turned out to be the case, you'd also get $1. This has now moved, when I looked half an hour ago, to a 94% chance. So what happens is there's a group of people that are trading, just like they're trading the stock market. They're looking for political news, they're adjusting the probabilities, they're buying and selling their shares according to the bits of news. You know, if there's something good or something bad, they'll change they'll buy or sell shares, and then at the end of the time, they'll then get their reward or lose their money. And does that work? Well, I'm sure you all know about Trudeau winning the Canadian election, and what a big shock it was. If you look at the prediction market, you can see a couple of weeks before, it was far from clear that he was going to win it. In fact, people thought he wasn't. People thought that Harper was going to win it. But for quite some time beforehand, almost a couple of weeks beforehand, he was rising. Certainly a week before, he was dominating the predictions. And this is routinely the case. They're very good at predicting the outcome of political results and other things. And it's a very interesting approach. This is Critius, one of my heroes. He was the king of Lydia, and he wanted to get advice from experts, from oracles. And so what did he do? He did exactly what he should do. He tested them for their accuracy. So he sent emissaries to 7 oracles asking what the king was doing at that current time. And Sue is just about to tell me what she thinks the Queen is doing this current moment.
I think she's drinking a cup of tea and eating cucumber sandwiches with the crust cut off.
Very good idea. And if that turns out to be the case, that'd be kind of impressive. What happened here is the oracle at Delphi reported that the king was making lamb and tortoise stew in a copper kettle, which turned out to be correct. And I'd be reasonably impressed if this queen is eating tea and cucumber sandwiches. I'd have been hugely impressed if Sue had said she'd been making lamb and tortoise stew in a copper kettle, and that had turned out to be right. That would just have been a really strong test. Anyway, so Critius concluded that the oracle at Delphi was best and gave her lots of gifts. And then he didn't like the Persians much, so he thought, I think I might attack them, and said, should I attack them? And Critius and the oracle at Delphi said, if you cross a river, a great empire will be destroyed. It's rather like that CIA announcement that Kennedy was given. It's not quite the answer you want. If you cross the river, a great empire will be destroyed. So he did attack. He thought, well, to get there, I've got to cross the river. That sounds fine. So he crossed the river, attacked. He lost, and it was actually his own empire that was destroyed. So it was sort of right. For reasons I don't quite understand, as a result of this rather dodgy history, what we consider the best method in using experts is called the Delphi technique, named after the Oracle of Delphi. I'm so obsessed, I took my family on holiday there a couple of years ago. So how does it work? Many of you have heard Nibu Mukherjee talking about this in a great talk. So you work out what your problem is, and you work out exactly what it is. Do you want a percentage answer? Do you want the number of votes something will get? What will the population of skylarks be next year? Whatever it might be. You then present the evidence, and you say, this is what we know. You then have a team of people. The team of people independently identify their answer, and anonymously. They're then collated. They're then discussed, and that can be online, and there's a case for it being online in terms of getting rid of various sources of bias. There's a case for it being head-to-head in that you have then better discussion sometimes, the case for each. And they then rescore. And then, again, you look at what the results are. People might include more material, more information, and that can go around a number of times until you end up presenting the results. So it is using the evidence and bringing together the evidence, but assessing it to decide what to do. So an interesting example of this is something called the intelligence game. And this was a game, and it came partly out of Tetlock's book, Tetlock showing that experts were useless, and all sorts of experiences where we failed to foresee a wide range of geopolitical events. You know, I'm sure you can think of plenty of well-known examples where the intelligence community just got it wrong. And they wanted to see if there are better ways of doing it. So they ran a competition. And they ran a competition where they had 5 teams, and the teams were asked to predict the outcomes of hundreds of geopolitical, economic, or military events. And they're very strict ones. So will Australia formally transfer uranium to India by the 1st of June 2014? Yes or no? And you give your probabilities. So you can say 60% or 90% or whatever, and then there are statistical ways of seeing how well you're doing. Obviously, if you're very confident and you're right, you get lots of marks. If you're very confident in one way and it goes the other way, you get a low score. It's called a BRIA score, and that's a very good way of tracking how people are doing. So there are 5 teams. There are 3 teams of geopolitical experts, some of whom have access to classified information. There's Mark Bergman. I'm sure many of you know Mark Bergman, a great botanist at University of Melbourne. He had 150 members of the public, so there are various botany students, postdocs, childhood friend of his wife, just various people that they knew, sort of ragbag collection. And they didn't have access to confidential information. They just looked things up on Google. And Philip Tetlock, who had basically the same sort of approach, had a much bigger team, 3,000 members, just using Google. So you have well-equipped professionals versus a bunch of amateurs using modern expert techniques. The question is, by how much did these geopolitical experts win? They must obviously trash these amateurs. So the results, first was Philip Tetlock, second was Mark Bergman, third, fourth, fifth were geopolitical experts. So the remarkable situation, Mark's wife's friend who works in a cafe in a mining company is outscoring geopolitical experts with access to confidential information. Astonishing, isn't it? So Philip Tetlock wrote a book about this, just come out, just read it, it's very interesting. And he talks about what he calls super predictors. And he talks, super forecasters, he talks about the fact that some people are just really good at this. So many of them have sort of beat the experts by about 30% consistently. And there's a small percentage, about 2%, which was 60% more accurate than the other experts, the geopolitical experts with the confidential information. They just completely trash them. And who are these people? They're not the sorts of people you'd expect. They're just ordinary members of the public looking things up on Google. But they use a variety of sources. They're very good at thinking probability of unpicking the story and then saying, well, if this happened, how likely is that? And then what might the various consequences of that be, etc. They're very good at working in teams. They keep a score to see how they're doing and think about that. They're very willing to admit errors and think, well, perhaps that isn't right from something else I've been told or read. I'll change course. So you have the remarkable position that the way in which you make the decision really, really matters, and you can beat obvious experts in doing so. So how can we use this? We use the Delphi technique and variants of it a lot in a lot of our work. So we produce an annual horizon scanning paper, and the process we have there is one of the sort of Delphi-like technique. We also have been collating the evidence for a long time on the effectiveness of interventions, and we've got this great body of information. And when the information's of a similar sort, the sensible thing to do is to do a meta-analysis and pull it together. But very often that evidence is of different sorts. Our pollination work, here will be changes in abundance, here will be change in diversity, here will be change in time spent feeding. You've got all these different measures. It's very hard to put those together. And we use experts to do that. And this is what we do. We use two main criteria. So how effective is it? So there might be one study in which it seemed really good, so that counts as being effective. And then how certain is it? So it's just one study, so that's not very certain. And so that would come down as unknown effectiveness. And if there's lots of evidence that it's really good, it's beneficial, and so on. And there's cases in which the intervention might turn out to be harmful, and then we have some other categories. So we can then classify them. And then just to illustrate the sort of thing you can do, we can look at Bycatch. We've got the evidence written down as to what works or not, the evidence written down about the different studies, all available online, and we can classify which seem to be beneficial, likely to be beneficial, etc. And we're doing hundreds of these. We're doing this on an industrial scale. So how can you use this sort of approach? And this is all underpinned by this body of information on bees and birds and farmlands and amphibians and bats, and a little bit on sustainable agriculture, a little bit on soils, a little bit on pest control. And we've got these coming out on carnivores and primates and reptiles and forests. One's being started on wetlands and invasives. And we want to cover all habitats and taxa. That's our plan for the next 5 years. So how can you use this? This is my first selfie. Imagine you're on a train to the Scottish policy group to give a talk. And imagine it's hard to believe that you haven't prepared your talk beforehand, and you're on the train working out what you're going to do using their Wi-Fi. And you think, well, they've just adopted some new ways of filling in, providing greening guidance for the European Union Common Agricultural Policy. And this is their advice. So it's all about creating buffer strips and providing nitrogen-fixing crops. The details don't really matter. So does that work? Well, you've got Wi-Fi, so you can go online. Here you are. You can look it up, the information in the farmland synopsis. So there's 19 studies, show that it seems to be great for arthropods, seems to be great for birds, seems to be pretty good for plants, seems to benefit small mammals. But then there are 6 studies, small number of studies, showing that it doesn't seem to have an effect. But overall, it seems great. And they can have it for riparian buffer strips, and also lots of evidence that that works. And then you can look at the consequences for soils and effects on biodiversity and erosion, organic carbon, et cetera, and the effects on bees, and the effects on birds, too. So you can do that in 10 minutes. So you can move from having a problem to having access to the literature almost instantaneously. And that's where I think we want to be. And that's our ambition. That's what I think policymakers and practitioners want. But is this worth doing? Does it make financial sense to do so? I'd just like to provide a few examples that might illustrate whether or not that's the case. So there's 3 major savings we could make. Firstly, we could stop doing things that we could find out don't work. Secondly, we could stop doing things that we already know don't work, but we haven't collated the information. And then thirdly, we could stop doing reports, repeatedly doing reports where the information is then lost, and then redo them again. Let's think how that works. So this is Andrea Sangeli. He's been studying harriers and white-tailed eagles in various places and pulling out evidence on the effectiveness of different interventions for France and Spain and Finland. These are all harriers, and that's white-tailed seagull. And for these different interventions, you can plot them according to the costs. These French ones are largely done by volunteers, so you could say are free. We might try to get some costing of these. These French ones very much differ in their effect. So, go back. In Spain, the whole range of interventions, and you can see that they differ massively in their effectiveness, some of which are damaging. In France, they vary in their effectiveness, so this turns out to be no more effective than that, but this is 2/3 the price. Look at white-tailed seagulls, the intervention that they routinely carry out there, 200 euros a nest, doesn't make any difference. So you could then say, supposing you were to do this differently, supposing you were to say, I want to have the same number of chicks produced, but just carry out the most effective interventions. If you did this across the areas, you'd save 400,000 euros. And I'm sure you all know that you can say, how much is it worth for me now to be given 400,000 euros for the next 10 years? And if you gave me 3.5 million euros, I'd be very happy with that. That's sort of the equivalent economic speak for that's what this is worth me now for this over the next 10 years. You can ask what the cost of a thesis is, 150,000 euros. So what then is the return on investment? The return on investment, normally a return on investment is sort of 10% is pretty good. The return on investment of going and finding out what works in interventions is 2,000%. And our examples, Andrew and I have some other issues on some other work looking at in-stream devices, where similarly you can show massive return on investment in finding out what works. It's crazy not to be doing this. Next example, you may well have heard the great talk by Anna Benitez and John Altrincham, in work with John Altrincham. And they did two things. Firstly, there are these bat bridges built over roads in order that bats can fly across them. This was a test done in, describes a test done in Norfolk and Suffolk. I think this is the hillier bit of Norfolk and Suffolk here. And when they tested them, there's no evidence that they worked. And they could test those of different ages. There's no evidence that they increased over time. And yet a huge sum of money has been spent on them. They've been put out in 14 different locations, but no one had ever tested them. The other great thing they've done is that they've written a bat synopsis in which they pull together all the evidence of effectiveness of interventions. And what it very often shows, I think of the 80 interventions, Anna can probably correct me, I think 50 there was no evidence at all. So there are all these interventions that are recommended to be carried out, but there's no science underpinning those recommendations. We're probably spending, as a society, around about 50 million pounds a year on these sorts of interventions for amphibians and bats. Surely we could spend 5 or 10% of that money in some way to find out what works. And a lot of these are the really basic interventions. We don't know whether or not bat bricks work, for example. There have been no tests of those. We certainly don't know what different designs of bat bricks work. So we could do a lot more. The next thing we could do is we could say which bits work. So we know that field margins for bees sort of works. Everyone knows that. But actually, there's lots of ways of doing that which don't work. And yet, often these are carried out. If we collated the information, we could just do those that work and not do those that don't work. That seems sensible. So I showed before we've collated the information on bycatch of seabirds. And this is available as an open access book, What Works in Conservation. Click that, and it goes to the database. And each one of these studies is described. Now, I showed you this at Intercol, but I've been given some lovely data since the EU that strengthens this case. So there's an EU report that looks at the impacts of bycatch on seabirds. And there's our bird synopsis, which also looks at ways of reducing bycatch of seabirds. And if you compare them, they're basically the same. We test slightly more interventions. We have slightly more papers, and we have a slightly higher number of peer-reviewed papers, but they're basically the same. The real difference is the EU kindly gave me the information as to how long it took from thinking of the idea to getting the report, and the answer is 34 months. How much did it cost? 134,000 euros. And I'm being a bit unfair. They did some other stuff as well, but this is a large chunk of it. You go to the bird synopsis, and you can look that up in minutes, and it's free. And that, to me, is where we should be as a society, so you can look up that information readily. So I then thought, so how much does this cost? You know, this costs £200,000. So the cost of 2 of these reports, we could do all of this, which provides the evidence on 322 interventions in a way that's available for everyone to use forever, rather than this report, which I challenge you to find if you don't know the title. It's basically disappeared. So collating the evidence seems such a cost-effective thing to do. So how much money do we spend on ineffective management? So this is just a wild guess, but if you look at the information for medicine, about 9 to 18% of the studies, the interventions they test, turn out to be ineffective. When we did a review of agri-environment schemes, 34 to 58% we thought were ineffective. If you look at the studies on conservation evidence, 31% turn out to be ineffective. And then let's do a bit of a fantasy study. Let's take the lowest of those values. The annual cost of conservation is about $11 billion. So, wild guess, we might be spending $1 billion a year on interventions that don't work. And okay, feel free to argue that. Well, perhaps that's 10 times too high. But we're certainly spending an enormous sum of money on things that don't work, and surely that's an insane thing for us to do. Surely we want to work out what works and spend that money more effectively. And I'd briefly like to say there's another reason why we need this. And I think here, we've talked a bit about policy making, but we've very much talked about conventional policy making. And there are ideas of different sorts of policy making. And we might want to encourage these or not, but whatever we do, they're just going to happen. And this is the idea of open policy making. And if you want to do it actively, you can say that that policymakers create platforms to collaboratively work out how to deliver policy. They have dialogue to share ideas. They look for other people to provide challenge with their ideas. They use new techniques to consult and share. And within open policymaking, there's this whole suite of ideas of things you could do. And we're moving in this way, and providing the evidence available and providing the data seems to me the modern way of doing things. We should have all the evidence available for anyone to use, and when something comes up, anyone can then look at that and then contribute to the discussion. That seems the modern way of thinking, rather than it all be by experts behind closed doors. We should accept that. I finally want to take a slightly different tack just to end this up. This is the very clever Tatsuo Amano. You can tell how clever he is. Whenever I see him, he's normally using at least 3 computers. And you may have heard his talk yesterday. This is the extremely interesting analysis, team of us with taking data from Wetland International. And these are the trends in Waterbird data. The main problem we have is there's too much data to present, and it's a real nightmare trying to work out how to present it. So there's data for 400 different species, and I think there's trends for over 300. And blue is good, and red and yellow is bad. So you can see North America, that's pretty good. Europe, not quite sure what's happening in Ireland, might partly be a climate change issue with things staying on the continent more. These are winter waterfowl counts. But Europe as a whole is doing pretty well. A new thing that this turned out is that the Middle East has serious conservation problems, which people haven't really realized now, but as a result of this analysis, it's been taken more seriously. Asia's sort of kind of okay, but then down the south, there are serious problems. There are serious problems in South America. There are serious problems in Africa. There appear to be some problems in the Pacific. If you look at the resident species, you can see there are also problems with the resident species here, suggesting that's a South American problem. You can see there are problems with resident species here, suggesting that's an African problem. there aren't problems with resident species here, suggesting the problem is actually further north, could be the breeding grounds, almost certainly the loss of the yellow sea, and quite possibly hunting en route. But overall, and there are big pluses and minuses, there are lots of good stories here. And I started thinking about this and thinking about other things, and then started thinking about the way we present information. So here is the wonderful BTO analysis of trends in bird populations. And I'm sure you've also, the graph I've always seen is it shows all species, and it shows woodland birds, and it shows farmland birds. But on average, they're kind of doing okay. So there are many species that have gone down, but then there are others that have gone up as well. But we emphasize this. We talk very much about the problems. Or similarly, butterflies. Butterfly survey started in 76, which of course was a super hot summer. After that, there have been declines in widespread birds, presumably the farmland bird type problem, as you have here, and the habitat specialists are perhaps not doing enormously well, but sort of, you know, their successes, some are going up, some are going down. So we're giving this dismal story, but to me it's not clear that it's necessarily entirely a dismal story. I think it's more complicated than that. And I think we should make a lot more of the considerable successes. And these successes are a consequence of ecological research combined with policy and practice making a real difference. So it's about the number of reintroductions. Large blue is the most famous one, but there are many others. It's about getting rid of various predators, such as black rats on Lundy, but the coypu, it's not a predator, I know, or mink and the Hebrides, and so on. And I should make it clear, I'm talking about the UK here. I accept there are many parts of the world in which the story is pretty universally dismal, but let's just think about the UK. Point pollution of fish populations used to be very common. There are very many areas that are far too polluted for fish, and now fish are doing much better in many of those areas. There's a number of predators. Pine martens, polecats, used to be very heavily persecuted, have now spread quite a lot. Habitat restoration. This is the wonderful Wallasey Island, partly a flood protection scheme, partly to take the mud out of Crossrail, but created this mind-boggling bit of habitat. There's auto-ecological studies leading to improvement of species, be it corncrakes or wide range of birds and invertebrates and plants. There have been species increases as a result of studies and actions. Organophosphates and the consequence of that, the late much missed Derek Radcliffe. Habitat management. A lot of our sites used to be pretty badly managed 20 or 30 years ago. We've now worked out the importance of coppicing, the importance of management. Or the fact that we've had a whole range of policies, conservation policies, put into place as a result of the evidence that's been put forward. And I could give other examples. I could talk about the pure work that's been done on parasite systems resulting in the successful eradication of foot and mouth, and that underpinned the science for HIV, etc. We could talk about acid rain, etc., etc. And I'm not for a minute denying that there are serious problems. Agriculture is not a great problem. Why? There isn't great biodiversity there. But trying to work out what to do about it with increasing food demands is still a serious problem that we haven't fully resolved. In woodland, there's all sorts of problems, and I think we still don't actually know what those problems are. I think there's still a lot more science needed. Tree diseases such as Chalara, major challenge. With increasing human populations, there will be increasing demands for infrastructure, lots of problems. Climate change, hopefully COP21 is going to solve all of that, but I'm sure there'll be some climate change issues. And then there's a whole suite of invasive species, of which I've shown Chalara, but there's a whole range of others. So the point I'm making is you could talk about this one of two ways. You could either say, it's all a disaster, the rivets are popping off the plane and it's just about to crash and everything's awful and we just need masses more money. Or you could say, there's been a whole suite of serious problems, which through research and science and policy, we've solved many of them, but there are many that we've yet to solve, and there are many that are up and coming more in the future, which we need to solve. And the question is, which of those is more honest? And I'd say the second is more honest. And the question is, which of those is more attractive to a policymaker or funder? And I would say that the second is much more of an attractive vision. So that's what I think we should be doing. And we can do this partly by connecting this with other societal interests. So flooding and land use change, getting away from this, the mad idea of the Somerset levels, that if you drain a river with a 1 in 3,000 gradient next to the bit of sea with a 3-meter tidal range, you're going to reduce the flooding inland. It's all about landscape use. The more we can get that argument, bring ecology together with the other parts of the community, the better. Or there's a lot of interest in nature-based solutions. So the EU is very much promoting this and saying, how can we use nature in order to deliver the services that we want? It's just a way of repackaging the story that we're all very familiar with, but it's attractive to them in terms of health, in terms of exercise, in terms of reducing crime, air pollution, noise, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my messages are, we should be more confident and positive about our successes and our capacity to deal with problems. We should stress we have an extensive body of research and theory to underpin our capacity to deliver on those problems. We should convince society that it's cost-effective to test effectiveness and collate information. Across the board, we need to reform how decisions are made. And we need to show how strong ecology can have a real impact. And I think the enthusiasm and the strong science here shows that we're doing lots of great things. We need to convince society that that's the case. And 2 final points. Firstly, as part of the opening of the David Attenborough building, we have an exciting conference organized by a number of people here in conjunction with the British Ecological Society and Cambridge Conservation Initiative on science and policy. This is the place to be. Come to that. Secondly, we'd be extremely grateful if you fill in your forms. Thank you.